Hyksos rule, which extended over the delta and down much of the Nile River Valley, with rival Egyptian power centers further south, appears to have been deeply resented by the Egyptians, or at least by the rulers of Egypt who followed them. Of course, they would be politically, motivated to paint the Hyksos in as negative a light as possible. And then later you've got Egyptian writers, in the 200s and 100s BC, who are under foreign domination after almost 1,000 years of various foreign invasions and dominations and foreign rule, who, for their own reasons and with their own biases, are going to be writing about the Hyksos. These are Egyptian historians like Manetho, writing about the Hyksos as, barbarian hordes in as negative a way as possible. And that may be accurate, but it may also reflect their biases, their context. And certainly the portrayal of the Hyksos by the 18th dynasty, which followed the Second Intermediate Period, would be motivated for political legitimacy's sake to paint the Hyksos in as negative a light as possible. Anyway, for Egyptians, as far as they're concerned, they lived in the greatest country on earth. As far as they were concerned, foreigners like the Hyksos should be paying them tribute, not ruling over them. They'd had, 1,500 years or so of unbroken rule, mostly unified, all native Egyptian rulers. And that harmony had been broken by the Hyksos. The Hyksos, this is a major development because the Hyksos are the first foreign rulers of Egypt. So you can imagine what a disaster this must feel like for nationalist Egyptians, at least nationalist in the ancient sense of the word. And of course, this is the argument of the 16th dynasty, which is simultaneously ruling in and around Thebes, while the 15th dynasty, the Hyksos, we designate them as the 15th dynasty, are ruling up north. Well, then the Hyksos, the 15th dynasty, is driven out of Egypt by the 17th dynasty, and Egyptian rule is restored to Egypt, thus ending the Second Intermediate Period and ushering in the New Kingdom era. Now, resented they might have been, but the Hyksos had changed Egypt in fundamental ways, especially for the average Joe. From the Hyksos home country of Southwest Asia, the Levant probably, it seems that this period saw the incorporation into daily Egyptian life of an improved loom, of new musical instruments like the tambourine and the lyre, of olive tree and pomegranate tree cultivation, of the humped-back bull. All these things are going to positively impact daily life in Egypt. Egypt, under the Hyksos, traded with the Minoans of Crete. The Egyptian state would never be the same either. So maybe this goes against being a positive for the daily life of Egyptians, but the Egyptian state would adopt a more expansionist foreign policy, perhaps to create a buffer against future Hyksos-like invaders, incorporating the horse and the chariot into its armies, maintaining a standing army at all times, and incorporating the composite bow that the Hyksos had brought with them. The 17th dynasty gave way to the glorious 18th dynasty, which established Egypt as the first world empire in history. The dynasty's armies swept down the Nile Valley into Nubia, pacifying that country under Amoset I, Amenhotep I, and Thutmose I, all the way to the Fourth Cataract, defeating Nubia's famous bowmen and hauling back gold and slaves, some of it on a ship whose prow was adorned with the upside-down corpse of a Nubian chieftain nailed in place. Thutmose I actually erected a stela at the empire's new southern border with an inscribed warning, something like, "Enemies will have their heads cut off, their families murdered, and have no successors." So there you go. Egypt's armies marched into the deserts to the east, into the deserts to the west. They conquered the Bedouin tribes there. They marched north across the Sinai and conquered every city-state and chieftaincy and petty kingdom in their wake, through Palestine, through Syria, and east to the Euphrates. And here Thutmose I erected another border stela, by the way, with similar warnings. Egypt now controlled territory from the Levant and the edge of Mesopotamia to the heart of Nubia. Thebes regained its previous status as a capital of united Egypt, regarded as religious capital with Memphis as political capital. It was on the west bank outside of Thebes where Thutmose I's tomb became the first in the Valley of the Kings. Tombs here were kept secret. Compare this to the totally obvious pyramid tombs of before, always the target of robbers, and almost completely stripped of their contents during the first and second intermediate periods. The Valley of the Kings is isolated and desolate. No one was going to settle here, so Thutmose I may have even used war captives to build his secret tomb and then killed them all when they were done. The age of the pyramid tomb had ended. Thutmose I was succeeded by Thutmose II, who'd married Thutmose I's daughter, Hatshepsut, when she was only 12 years old. After Thutmose II died a couple of decades later, Hatshepsut herself ruled as a regent for her nephew and stepson, Thutmose III, but as ruler, she became king, sending a trading expedition all the way to Punt. So we're talking here probably modern Eritrea or Somalia. And you can see carvings of this expedition, carvings of the land of Somalia or Punt, found on the walls of her mortuary temple here. I'm across on the west bank across from Thebes. And as you look, you can see houses on stilts. You can see thatched roofs and ladders leading up to them. You can see giraffes and ivory and incense and all the luxury goods that Punt was famous for. You can see the Queen of Punt and a princess. She was clearly very proud of this expedition as she tells the story of her life on the walls of her mortuary temple here. She also ordered the production of 2 massive obelisks to be placed in the temple complex at Karnak. And like her father, she was buried in the Valley of the Kings, just over this cliff. For 20 years, Thutmose III had lived in Hatshepsut's shadow. Years after her death, he finally ordered references to Hatshepsut scratched out or otherwise erased from the record, apparently hoping to excise any mention of a female pharaoh. It went against tradition. Finally a king in his own right, Thutmose III emerged as a mighty warrior pharaoh, referred to now by some as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Actually, his tomb is right up here. It's blocked off, unfortunately. I'm not allowed up there. I actually just got yelled at, but it's right up there. He reasserted Egyptian power in Palestine, famously victorious at the Battle of Megiddo, which involved a 7-month siege and the use of a tank-like battering ram. Then he spent the better part of 2 decades conquering Syria, 18 years or so, or reinforcing Egyptian power there through marriage alliances. He too was eventually buried, as I mentioned, right here in the Valley of the Kings, high up on this remote cliff. The steps leading up to it purposefully carved away so that it might remain inaccessible and hidden. Of course, these are a modern construction. His successor, Amenhotep II, continued his father's militant tradition, invading Nubia and reasserting Egyptian power there. Amenhotep II apparently liked to hang the corpses of his Nubian enemies upside down, whether on his ships or on the walls of the temple complex at Karnak. His successor, Thutmose IV, carried out military expeditions too, additionally erecting the world's tallest obelisk. By the way, that obelisk is in Rome today for various reasons. But this is Thutmose IV's tomb. Somehow I'm here by myself, here in the Valley of the Kings, in the tomb of a figure as important as Thutmose IV. I have the tomb to myself. This is his actual sarcophagus. Pretty incredible stuff. Look at this. No one here. Just me. Pretty awesome. Thutmose IV was succeeded by Amenhotep III. Unlike his predecessors, Amenhotep III was more of a lover than a fighter, or at least more of a diplomat, concluding alliances through marriage with several foreign rivals. He even married a Mitanni princess, Mitanni far, far away. he built a palace for himself and his wives and his children here at Thebes, and a mile-long pleasure lake for one of his wives. And he seems to have spent most of his time hunting. According to the official record, if we want to believe that, he once snagged 56 bulls in a single day, and he killed over 100 lions over 10 years of hunting. Now, pharaohs typically spent their time between Memphis and Luxor, so they lived in both, but Amenhotep III seems to have more or less lived here at Thebes. Okay? Thebes becoming more and more important. Now, his mummy has such bad teeth that probably indicates that he suffered greatly in his later years. His mortuary temple was fronted by these massive colossi. The Greeks called them the Colossi of Memnon, but they're actually Amenhotep III. And then, like his predecessors, he was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Amenhotep III's son, Amenhotep IV, began his reign pretty normally. He'd married the beautiful Nefertiti, who was a commoner. He'd co-ruled for a few years with his father, and now he ruled in his own right. But by around year 5, he changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. The Aten is the sun disk, or the sun orb. And in a historical first, Akhenaten declared that Aten was not just the most powerful of the gods, but was the only god. Think about that. In a world made up of pantheons of gods, here was a purely monotheistic declaration. Aten was the god, and in a universalist sort of way, a god for all peoples, not just for the Egyptians. In keeping with this sweeping change, Akhenaten seems to have moved his capital a couple hundred miles north of Thebes to what we now call Tel El Amarna. This was his holy city, Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten. And within its confines, no army would be allowed. In truth, Akhenaten may have been forced to move by the powerful priestly class in Thebes. You practice this new monotheistic thing and get out of here. Though he assured his own followers that Aten showed him the place, and that he, Akhenaten himself, would never leave the holy city, Akhetaten. Akhenaten forbade the fashioning of images of Aten. Only he could know Aten, he claimed. And he may have even melted down all images of other gods across Egypt. That's going to make a lot of enemies. Meanwhile, Akhenaten was composing hymns to Aten himself. And as if to emphasize his uniqueness, depictions of Akhenaten in art are groundbreaking. Rather than the strong-looking, perfectly proportioned pharaohs of centuries past, he is presented imperfectly shaped, always with an elongated face. And rather than scenes of his conquests or his participation in religious rituals, he's enjoying everyday life with his family. He had 6 daughters. And this was new. Meanwhile, the once powerful priestly class complained that under Akhenaten, the old temples were neglected and overrun with weeds. But cloistering himself in his new capital essentially cut Egypt off diplomatically from its neighbors. The pharaoh was in turn cut off from his own military, which he seems to have more or less entirely neglected, so that when he died in the 17th year of his reign, his teenaged successor, Tutankhaten, probably his son, decided to move the capital back to Thebes and change his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamen. It seems the experiment in universal monotheism was over. King Tut even chose a tomb site in the Valley of the Kings, one close to his grandfather, Amenhotep III, rather than be anywhere near his father, Akhenaten. In any case, King Tut didn't live long. Around age 18, he died suddenly, possibly murdered by his 60-year-old vizier, Aya, who succeeded him as pharaoh and married his wife. Speaking of Tut's wife, there's evidence she may have known of Aya's plans, written to the Hittites for help, but was stymied when the prince the Hittites sent to Egypt to marry her was in turn murdered. See, by the mid-1300s BC, the Hittites had arisen as a new power in West Asia, based in modern-day Turkey. So for her to invite a foreign prince to be pharaoh, and a Hittite at that, speaks perhaps to her fear, to the level of her fear. Well, as it turned out, Aya himself only ruled for 4 years before he was succeeded by military man Horemheb. Horemheb had been a general under Amenhotep III, only to languish like all the other military leaders during the pacifistic reign of Akhenaten, and then get promoted to the king's right-hand man under Tutankhamun. He also led military campaigns into Syria and Libya during this time, and he married into the royal line. That's the key here. Now Pharaoh himself, Horemheb, would rule for more than a quarter century. His king lists erased the names of anyone associated with the Amarna heresy. Akhenaten, of course, but also Tutankhamun, and even Aya. For Horemheb, these guys never existed, and he had directly succeeded his old commander-in-chief, Amenhotep III. It goes from Amenhotep III straight to him. He tore down Akhenaten's temples. He used the stone for his own building projects, of which there were many. And everywhere Tutankhamun's name had been inscribed, he scratched it out and he wrote his own. As ruler, Horemheb reformed the military, incorporating priests into the ranks in order to tie the religious and military establishments together. And he established separate northern and southern military commands. Now, the last 3 pharaohs, Tutankhamun, Aya, and Horemheb, had all died without heirs. Thus ended the 18th dynasty. But Horemheb's vizier had children and grandchildren. In other words, a secure line. And now he becomes the first pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, Ramses I. Now, he reigned for a couple years, and then he was succeeded by his son, Seti I. Now, Seti reasserted Egyptian power abroad. In Syria, where he captured forts and enslaved his enemies, bringing many of them back to Egypt, and his armies also marched into Libya. Here at his mortuary temple in Abydos, there's a king list, especially interesting in that it is devoid of several key names. Hatshepsut is missing, as if this female pharaoh never existed. Akhenaten's isn't there, nor Tutankhamun's, nor Aya's, thereby erasing any ruler connected with the Amarna heresy. This was an attempt to rewrite history, something that Egyptian pharaohs never seem to have had much of a problem with. That goes for rulers all over the world, I guess. Seti I chose to build his mortuary temple here at Abydos, which was the cult center of Osiris. It's where Osiris's completed body that had been put back together by Isis was supposed to have been buried, or depending on the tradition, his head at least was buried here. In fact, this is the Osirion, where Osiris's body was said to be buried, and pilgrims would come here from all over Egypt. I mean, for centuries and centuries, they would come here. This was the cult center for Osiris. And the question is, was this built during the time of Seti I, which is sort of the consensus, or are some of those contrarian archaeologists and historians right in saying that this way predates by many, many centuries, all the way going back to the Old Kingdom, Seti I. You got the huge giant granite blocks, the fact that it's almost subterranean, it's 30 feet down from Seti's mortuary temple right next door. There's a chance that this was discovered in the building of Seti's temple and that he simply took credit for it. But either way, he chose this very symbolic, powerfully meaningful place for his mortuary temple, Abydos, site of not just the cult center of Osiris, but also the tombs of the first dynasty pharaohs. But Seti I's greatest legacy came in the form of his son and successor, Ramses II. And it was Ramses II, actually, who finished the mortuary temple to his father, Seti I. Ramses ruled for 67 years. 67 years. No ancient pharaoh ordered the construction of more buildings than Ramses II. His temples and public works and palaces and statuary are all over Egypt. Ramses moved the capital from Thebes in the south to where the Hyksos had established it at Avaris, actually a couple kilometers north of Avaris, at a site he called Pi Ramses. Ramses had actually grown up around Avaris, so it makes some sense he'd move his base up there, but it also made sense from a military perspective there in the delta. Still, he continued to add to the glory of Thebes and everywhere else too. Here at the far south of Egypt, almost at the modern border with Sudan, he built a very unique and imposing temple carved right out of the mountain, surely as a warning to Nubians traveling down the Nile north toward Egypt proper. From their ships, they would have seen the towering statues of Ramses himself, not to mention the pharaoh's clearly Nubian captives tied up and at Ramses' mercy. Ramses II was a conqueror, pacifying the raiding Libyans in the west and warring with the Hittites in the northeast. For the better part of a century, the Egyptians and the Hittites, these are the two great powerhouses of the region. One already ancient, the other relatively new. These two guys had fought each other, and their fortunes go back and forth. They're both winning, they're both losing in turn, until Egyptian expansion was stopped by the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh in what is now Syria. This is during the 5th year of Ramses II's reign. The Battle of Kadesh was a costly engagement for both parties, followed by more back and forth without a clear victor, though you'd never know it from Ramses II's inscriptions. He'd inscribe an account of his great victory at Kadesh in stone all over the place. In fact, there's a famous depiction of the Battle of Kadesh inscribed right here at Abu Simbel in the far south. Finally, about 15 years after Kadesh, the two sides hammered out a peace treaty that was ratified in 1258 BC and sealed over the years by marriages between Ramses and two different Hittite princesses. In return, the Egyptians apparently sent sought-after Egyptian doctors to attend to the Hittite royal family. The treaty, really a full-fledged non-aggression pact with defense agreements thrown in and trade agreements thrown in. So this treaty may have been the first ever to be written down, first non-aggression pact to be written down. First it was written in cuneiform on silver tablets, and then it was written in hieroglyphics or hieroglyphs on temple walls in Karnak, and even way down here in Abu Simbel. And there's a copy of it hanging in the UN building in New York today. Now, the second half of Ramses' life was spent focused on the afterlife. He went through something, and he's apparently inspired by the deaths of his beloved chief wife, Nefertari. Her temple's right here, too. The deaths of several of his sons, including his oldest son. So in his own tomb, the main room in his tomb probably contained more treasure than any other room in the world. He also built a beautiful tomb for Nefertari. He built a massive tomb for his scores of sons with hundreds of rooms, multiple levels. In fact, an entire town was established there at Thebes just to work on these tombs. But as so often happens after a state embarks upon massive building projects and imperial adventure, what historians are going to later label a zenith. I like to use that word, zenith. The reign of Ramses II was the zenith, but it was quickly followed by decline. Well, that's very common in history. You got the zenith, and then you have quick decline right after. By the end of the century, Egypt is forced to pull back from its empire in Southwest Asia, pulled back from its empire here in Nubia, retracting to Egypt proper in the face of multiple invasions. From the west, the Libyans raided Egypt with abandon. From the Mediterranean, you have the mysterious plundering sea peoples who've already severely depopulated Mycenaean Greece and helped topple the Hittite Empire. Sea peoples. They invade Egypt and almost overwhelm it. And the reigns of the pharaohs after Ramses II tend to be much shorter. Of course, that's not hard to do given the length of his reign, but they tend to be much, much shorter, with the notable exception of Ramses III of the 20th dynasty. Ramses III may have been Egypt's last great pharaoh. There's an incredible scene from the north wall of the Habu Temple in Thebes. This is Ramses III's mortuary temple. which often doubled as his palace whenever he was at Abiz. And there, at this temple, there's a depiction that is thought to illustrate Ramses III's alleged victory over the Sea Peoples. It's pretty incredible to stand in front of. He's also credited with repelling the Libyans. Well, victories or not, these invasions take their toll, and the retraction continues. Egypt even had to abandon some of its far-flung turquoise mines. Meanwhile, you've got rising prices of various goods, economic turmoil, and the pharaohs are so weak, they can't even protect the Valley of the Kings and environs, as royal tomb after royal tomb was robbed. By the reign of the 20th dynasty's last pharaoh, Egypt's neighbors felt so secure that they were openly mistreating the pharaoh's emissaries without consequence. That never would have happened in ages past. Now, in the 1080s BC, in the 1070s, and the 1060s, rebellion arose from within, as Thebes in the south broke away from the kings of the north, ultimately bringing the New Kingdom era of Egyptian history to an end. And what we'll see after the New Kingdom is a few weak dynasties competing north and south, and then the Libyans come in, the Nubians come in, the Assyrians come in, the Persians come in, the Greco-Macedonians come in, the Romans come in. It's foreigners, foreigners, foreigners. The ancient glory of the Old Kingdom, recaptured to an extent during the Middle Kingdom, recaptured during the New Kingdom, will never be recaptured in Egypt again.